In an age where it seems like bad trends are taking over the gaming industry, we often ignore some positive trends that we have started to see in recent years. So here's some good gaming trends I just want to talk about. Cross-platform play used to feel like a novelty. When the game supported it, that fact got advertised like a special feature instead of a baseline. Most of the time, your platform choice dictated who you could play with. If your friends split between systems, someone either had to rebuy the game on the same system or just sat out if they didn't have it. Communities fractured and matchmaking pools shrank faster than they should have, and none of that benefited the players, and it definitely didn't benefit games that relied on active populations to survive. Once games like Fortnite, Rocket League, Minecraft, and COD normalized crossplay around 2019 or so, the downside of closed ecosystems became obvious. Larger shared player pools meant faster matchmaking, longer lasting communities, and games stopped feeling dead a year after launch because the population wasn't locked to a single platform. More importantly, you stopped choosing hardware based on where your friends happen to be, and instead picked the platform that you just preferred. Limits still exist, and they do matter. Competitive games often separate inputs because mouse and keyboard changes the balance in ways aim assist can't always solve, and that's fair for very obvious reasons. Some games let you opt out of crossplay because not everyone wants to play with people on other platforms. Voice chat and party systems can still feel clumsy because platforms handle social features differently, although with Discord integrations, it's not much of an issue anymore. One of the most surprising parts of this to me is Nintendo adopting crossplay, since they've always been very closed off, but it's good to see that they have joined in with other platforms, because otherwise some games on the Switch, for example, would have much smaller pools of players. If you're enjoying this video so far, comment your favorite good gaming trend, and also be sure to subscribe. For a long time, console players didn't really have a choice when it came to frame rate. Big releases ran at 30 frames per second, and that was just treated as the norm. If a game looked impressive enough in screenshots and trailers, the trade-off was considered acceptable, at least by some people. Over time, that standard just became the expectation. If you played on console, you just had to accept that big AAA releases were likely going to be 30 frames per second. Frame rate isn't cosmetic though. It changes how a game responds to you. Input delay, camera motion, animations, and timing are all part of this. And once you adjust to smoother motion, going back does not feel good. Performance modes mattered so much when they became common on current-gen PlayStation and Xbox hardware because they gave you more agency. If you wanted to, you could have higher quality graphics and give up some of that frame rate. But if you care more about performance, you could have slightly worse graphics and a lower resolution, and maybe even get up to 120 frames, although it isn't commonplace yet on consoles, but there are games that support it. Of course, good PCs never had this problem, but a large percentage of gamers still exclusively play on consoles. There are, of course, plenty of games that still do struggle with frame rates. This isn't in every game, but I've been seeing this a lot more recently, and it's just good to have that choice. Portable gaming used to come with an asterisk. You played handheld games because you weren't home, not because the experience itself necessarily held up. The scope was smaller and mechanics were usually a lot simpler. Handhelds were simply something different you played when you were on the go, or if you just wanted to lay in bed or something, or if you were like me and had to hide your DS under the covers. Then when the Switch came out in 2017, it broke that separation by refusing to split the experiences. It didn't sell itself as the most powerful system, but you could play the same game anywhere. You had the same save file, same content whether you were docked or not. It sounds very obvious now 9 years later, but it wasn't at the time. Previous handhelds relied on separate versions or companion titles that existed to fill gaps instead of replacing the core experience. And this decision changed how games were built. It was crazy to have something like Breath of the Wild, which was the most expansive Zelda game ever at the time, on a tiny system. It wasn't like it was a portable version of Zelda. I mean, it was, but it was just Zelda, and you could play it no matter where you were. None of these games felt compromised, and they simply felt like console games. Like, look at the 3DS, which got first-party games in 2019. It's a great system for what it is, and I love the 3DS, but the hardware was ancient when it released in 2011 and even older in 2019. The Switch, once again, was not a powerhouse, but these look like home console games. And after the massive success of the Switch, other companies followed from different directions. The Steam Deck leaned into ownership and flexibility, like you bring your PC library with you. Some games run perfectly fine, some need some tweaking, and some simply just don't belong there at all. And that inconsistency is the trade-off. Devices like the ROG Ally chase raw performance instead and push for higher frame rates and compatibility at the cost of battery life and price. Nintendo still dominates the space because you turn the system on and play. There's no setup, there's no troubleshooting. And while the Switch was definitely showing its age, and getting to a point where it couldn't really play most games coming out now, the Switch 2 has really impressed me so far, and it's just crazy to me, like the games we can play on the go now, compared to handheld games less than a decade ago. Backwards compatibility used to be something that wasn't expected. It was a nice extra companies could include if it was convenient, and drop it if it wasn't. And that worked when most people owned a handful of games per generation, and physical collections stayed small, but it stopped working the moment digital libraries became normal. Once your purchases tied themselves to accounts instead of shelves, losing access just felt a lot worse. You don't think in terms of generations when you buy games anymore, but in terms of ownership. A game you bought 5 or 10 years ago doesn't necessarily feel old, it just feels like part of your library. When the Xbox One came out, it didn't have backwards compatibility at first, but it added 360 games and even some original Xbox games later on. And also some of these older games didn't just work, but they actually loaded faster, and some of them even had improvements. So it went beyond preservation, and actually improve the game you already had. PlayStation followed a similar path by making PS4 compatible on PS5, and some of these games had free enhancements, faster load times, higher resolutions, and it immediately just makes your library seem bigger when you can play an entire generation, not just physically, but also the digital storefront on the new gen systems. And remember, the PS4 couldn't play PS3 games, so this was a big step. Then with Nintendo, they of course had backwards compatibility plenty of times before. The GBA could play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, the DS could play Game Boy Advance games, 3DS could play DS games, the Wii could play GameCube games, and the Wii U could play Wii games. And then with the Switch, there was none for obvious reasons. I mean, it would be a little ridiculous to put a Wii U disc in your Switch. But since we got the Switch 2, which is just a more powerful Switch, we got backwards compatibility and some performance boosts for certain games. And something else I want to touch on a little more is having access to that full digital storefront is just extremely convenient. And I'm interested to see when we get the next generation of consoles if they're still going to be compatible with the 8th gen consoles. Load times used to dictate how games were structured, whether you noticed it or not. Fast travel existed, but you sometimes would avoid it unless you really needed it just because of how brutal some load times were. Death carried extra frustration because it meant waiting, sometimes over a minute, and restarting a mission or booting the game back up just felt like a slog. Developers would work around this with elevators, narrow corridors, forced walking sections, slow door animations, and also this. These weren't always creative choices, but just technical ones. But since SSDs have become more prevalent, load times are so much more bearable. When games load in seconds instead of minutes, the pacing just changes immediately. You can experiment more because failure doesn't punish you with downtime. Fast travel becomes something you actually use more, and open worlds feel more cohesive because assets stream quickly without obvious loading. Even starting a game stops feeling like a commitment. Like, remember running GTA 5 on old systems, how long that could take? Like, the difference is obvious. If you load a large PS4 era game on original hardware, then load it on a PS5 or Series X, the game itself hasn't changed, but it just loads so much quicker. And I feel like we kind of take it for granted now just because for the past few years we've gotten used to it. But kids today will never know what it was like to wait like 2 minutes every time you died in a game. Indie games didn't rise because players suddenly wanted cheaper alternatives. They rose because large-scale development started failing at specific things. As budgets grew and teams ballooned, timelines stretched, and with that risk tolerance collapsed, big games became safer, longer, and more expensive, often at the cost of focus. When something went wrong, fixing it meant months of patches or paid expansions. Smaller teams filled that gap by doing less and doing it better. Games like Hades, Celeste, Hollow Knight, Stardew Valley, Undertale, Dead Cells, these were very focused games that didn't have massive budgets. They picked a core idea and refined it until it worked. The controls felt tight, feedback was clear, and they're simply just fun games. But not only that, but these were a lot more affordable. Look at something like Hollow Knight Silksong, which you can get something like 70 hours out of, and it's $20. And I don't like the argument that more hours necessarily means it should cost more, but it's a very high quality game. If you want to get more hours out of your game for your money, a lot of indie games are great choices for this. Games don't need a massive budget to feel complete, they just need that core focus, they need new ideas. And on the opposite end of the spectrum from Hollow Knight Silksong, you do have some shorter indie games where you don't need to commit that much time to, and they're usually pretty cheap as well. Something like Celeste was a game I thoroughly enjoyed, and it only took me a few hours, and it didn't need to be longer, it was perfect for what it was. Most games from big publishers now just feel a little too bloated, and I know you may say, how is it a bad thing to have a game be longer? But sometimes it's nice to just play through a game in a few hours. Now this isn't brand new, we've been getting more mainstream indie games for the past decade and a half or so, but indie games have only continued to grow. Revisiting older games used to require commitment. You needed the original console, the original game, working hardware, the right cables, and sometimes an old TV just to get it to look good. If you didn't keep that equipment, your options narrowed pretty quickly. Emulation filled the gap for some people, but of course there's going to be trouble with setups, and sometimes things that aren't perfect, and for a lot of people they just don't want to deal with that, and that led to a lot of old games just falling out of reach for people. Modern platforms changed that by lowering the barrier to almost nothing. Nintendo Switch Online is the most visible example. For a yearly fee, you could boot up NES, SNES, Game Boy, and 64 games, GameCube games, and more, with no setup, no hunting for cartridges, and spending $400 for a 20-year-old game. And not only that, but there's more save states and rewind features, so it can remove some of the frustrations from games that didn't age well. PlayStation offers similar access through its subscription tiers, bundling classic titles, and some of the PS Plus packages. Now, there is a trade-off here, and we can't ignore it. You don't own these games, you're just renting access to them, and that's something you'd say is a bad trend. Going as far back as the Wii, you used to be able to buy and own classic games through Nintendo Virtual Console, and on one hand it's better because you actually own them, but you'd also had to pay for each game, when here you just pay a flat fee for the year and get access to all these. I think there's pros and cons to both, but I personally think that an NSO subscription is worth it if you like classic Nintendo games, at the price point that it's at. There was a stretch not too long ago where everything needed an account. Single player games asked you to sign in before you could reach the menu, offline modes failed without server checks, and launchers just stacked on top of launchers. It just slowed down the experience, it just made it a slog. None of this was needed, and booting up a game stopped feeling immediate. There was a lot of pushback from players, and things have started to improve. More games now let you play without linking accounts or creating extra profiles. Offline modes function properly, and you can start a game without agreeing to multiple term screens that have nothing to do with gameplay. It's not universal, it is still a bit of an issue, but we are going in the right direction. Losing a save file used to be a huge risk. Hard drives would fail, memory cards could corrupt, and sometimes consoles just died. If you didn't manually back things up, your progress disappeared. Hundreds of hours could vanish without warning, and no one wanted that. But then with cloud saves, while not perfect, have largely fixed this issue. On all modern platforms, your progress follows you automatically. If you switch consoles, upgrade hardware, reinstall a game months later, and your save is there and it doesn't even need to take up space on your console, you don't think about it because you don't have to. That's not flashy, but it is a lot more convenient than we give it credit for. And the last thing I want to talk about is better storefronts and refund policies. Digital purchases used to be final in the worst way. If a game ran poorly or didn't function on your system, or simply wasn't what you expected, it was on you. There's no refunds, nothing you could really do. And it discouraged players from trying out new games just because they didn't know if they were going to like it. Steam changed this by normalizing refunds under clear conditions. If a game doesn't work or you just don't like it within a short window, all you have to do is request a refund. And that single policy shift did more for consumers than we really give it credit for. On Steam, it's clear. If you've owned the game for less than 2 weeks and have played for less than 2 hours, you can request a refund. PlayStation has a pretty fair process for refunds as well. Same for Xbox. Nintendo's a little more complicated, but this is very good for consumers. And there you have it. There's a handful of good gaming trends. Now, not all of these are black and white. Some of them do have some drawbacks. But since there are a lot of bad gaming trends that we've been seeing and a lot that have been the focus of many YouTube videos, I didn't want to just focus on some of the positives. Let me know your favorite gaming trend in the comments. And if you like this, I have a bunch of other content you'll probably like, so be sure to subscribe.